We'll get started in just a second here. I'm just trying to find this PowerPoint file on my computer. It's not what it should be. Here we go. Okie dokie, so I think we're ready to start here. Basically, we're starting a new unit. We just finished the age of the scientific revolution. No, the age of exploration. And now we're moving on to a unit that's called the age of absolutism. And so I'm going to pop this over here, open up my PowerPoint. That's the wrong one. And the age of absolutism is referring to the period of time in Europe where state powers, okay, and this should say actually Unit 4 here. Okay, European state powers are centralizing during this time. And when they centralize under the authority of a king. And as a byproduct of that, we have a bunch of absolutist type monarchies that are established across various places in Europe. And that includes France in particular, but also Austria and Prussia, Russia. Each of them turns into absolutist states. But really, before we talk about this, I actually have to bring you back. I'm realizing right now I have to bring you back a little bit and talk to you about the last religious war, because this is going to serve as the bridge between like quarter 1 and quarter 2, basically. So let me open up this PowerPoint here, and we're going to pop down here to the 30 Years' War. Okay. So, talking a bit about the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War happens from 1618 to 1648. It starts with that one event that I told you guys about a while ago in Unit 2 called the Defenestration of Prague. That's where they throw those Catholic guys out the window. And depending on who you ask, they either say, if you ask other Catholics, they say, oh yes, well they were gently brought to the ground by the grace of an angel. If you say the reason they didn't die, and you ask a Protestant, they basically will tell you, well, it's because they fell into a giant pile of horse manure. And so this is the event that starts the 30 Years' War, and it's the last major war of religion in Europe. So religious intolerance led to large mercenary armies of Catholic and Protestant states fighting over these German territories in the Holy Roman Empire, which at the time was made up of 1,000 autonomous, meaning self-governed states of all sizes. For example, Swabia was divided among 68 secular and 40 ecclesiastical, meaning church, lords, like bishops or whatever. And so, these territories have a lot of religious pluralism going on. And as you can see from this map here, this is the Holy Roman Empire, a map roughly depicting the territories of it in 1618. You can see it's a mess, and even within some of these, they would have been further subdivided between a bunch of different lords. But there's basically 1,000 different autonomous entities within the Holy Roman Empire at this time, which makes up most of Central Europe. Here you can see this gray line is the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire in 1648. But we have to talk a little bit about the 30 Years' War. Okay, here's another one depicting the bounds of the Holy Roman Empire. This is what is now modern-day Germany, part of Poland, Austria, Hungary, etc. So let's talk about how the 30 Years' War happens. Okay, I promised you that we would come back and talk about this one day in the future, but there was just other things we needed to talk about first. But this is going to serve as the gap, the bridge of the gap between basically the age of exploration and the age of the Protestant Reformation and the age of absolutism, which is what our next unit is. That's why I wanted to wait on it, is kind of to reinitiate some past learnings about the religious pluralism that was happening in Europe at this time. So the Holy Roman Emperor of this time is a guy named Rudolph II, all right? And he launched a long crusade against Protestantism in 1578, breaking the tradition with the Peace of Augsburg. Okay, the Peace of Augsburg had been negotiated in 1555, and it had for a time put some, limits, like the cuius regio eius religio thing was, which I know I'm saying wrong, but basically, he who reigns, so the religion. That was the agreement of the Peace of Augsburg to try to stop religious warfare between Holy Roman Empire states. And in 1578, Rudolph II launches a long campaign against Protestantism, and it lasts up until 1606 with something called the Peace of Vienna. But Rudolph was incompetent. He was a recluse, meaning that he did not like to go out into public. He was very isolative. Everyone was pleased with this peace except for him. Okay, he's the only one who's really vested in continuing the war. His brother, being that Rudolph didn't have any legitimate heirs, his brother Matthias is the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. And he marches with the Hungarians against his own brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph. So Matthias, the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor, marches against his older brother, the Emperor. Rudolph surrendered, and it caused a decline in the Holy Roman Empire's authority. Remember that unlike France, unlike England, unlike Spain, the Holy Roman Empire does not go through that process of centralization, nor does Italy until much, much, much later. So Rudolph II surrenders. This causes a decline in the Holy Roman Empire's authority. It's going to prevent them once again from being able to unify, and increased hostility, and it became more militarized as well. So now the new guy is Matthias. Matthias became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1612, but he dies in 1619. All right, so it's a short-lived reign. And his nephew, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, I'm going to keep my voice down. I have so much lecturing to do. I'm so used to just projecting my voice. His nephew, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, and the ruler of Hungary and Bohemia became the next Holy Roman Emperor. And so Matthias dies, Archduke Ferdinand, okay, is the new Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, so he becomes Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, okay? Ferdinand II, it's going to be important because we're going to be introducing ourselves. So there's Ferd and Fred, Okay, don't get Ferd and Fred mixed up. Okay, Ferdinand and Frederick. Ferdinand is the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, Ferd II. He limited Protestant worship in Bohemia. Okay, the defenestration of Prague happens. Calvinists revolt against the Roman Catholic Church and the Habsburg dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, these are all Habsburgs that we've been talking about. So the Protestant rebels offer, I was already about ready to start talking loud again. The Protestant rebels offer the Bohemian throne. Bohemia is a state within the Holy Roman Empire. The Protestant rebels offer the Bohemian throne to a Calvinist elector by the name of Frederick. Okay, so he's a noble, and Frederick is a Calvinist. And so the Calvinists choose Frederick to take the throne of Bohemia, because once again we're seeing religious upheaval in what is now basically Austria and the Czech Republic. Okay, Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic. So, and that's whenever you hear that term Bohemia, Bohemia refers to the lands of where now the modern-day Czech Republic rests. Okay, so moving forward, Protestants and Catholics start fighting over Vienna, which was the Habsburg capital of Austria. And France, okay, even though France is Catholic and has been subduing Calvinists for a long time, they ally politically to their advantage with Frederick's Protestant forces. Okay, France, remember, is now surrounded by the Spanish Habsburgs on one side and the Austrian Habsburgs on the other side. And so France allied with Frederick's Protestant forces. Despite the fact that France is Catholic, they ally with Frederick's Protestant forces. And the Catholic League, which is the mercenary army that was hired by the Holy Roman Emperor, who is Ferd, he's the Catholic, okay? So there's Ferd the Catholic and Fred the Protestant. Just get that straight, and that'll help you. So Ferd the Catholic, Holy Roman Emperor, Habsburg monarch, all right? He hires this Catholic League force led by a guy named Johannes von Tilly. And von Tilly is a mastered general, okay? He is a really tried and true commander. And he defeated the Protestant army in 1623 and forced Frederick to abandon his claims to the throne of Bohemia. So the Catholics come out strong in the 30 Years' War, being led by Johannes von Tilly. Frederick, though, isn't willing to give up yet. What he does is he turns to Scandinavia, which is Northern Europe, for assistance. Excuse me. And as a byproduct of that, Scandinavia gets drawn into this conflict with Denmark. So the next phase of the 30 Years' War kind of goes through several phases. And the first phase that we're going to be talking about now is the Danish phase. All right. So in 1625, the king of Denmark was a guy named Christian IV. And he's Protestant. Okay. He's Protestant king of Denmark. And he assists Frederick, okay, this guy who had just been defeated by Tilly. He assists Frederick by marching troops south from Denmark into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, what is now Germany. And he had expected to get help from England, who was also Protestant, France, who was Catholic, but they had lent their aid to the Protestants, and the Netherlands, which were also Protestant. But he doesn't get help from any of them. Meanwhile, another mercenary by the name of Albrecht Wallenstein, who was a Bohemian noble and Catholic convert, even though he was raised Lutheran, marched north with 30,000 men. Okay, so Albrecht Wallenstein is this guy who was raised Protestant but converts to Catholicism, and he's kind of an odd guy. because Wallenstein kind of demonstrates how the 30 Years of War, evolved from this religious war into a dynastic struggle, a political war about state boundaries, and a free-for-all for mercenaries of fortune. So he's kind of one of these guys who is trying to look to make a name for himself as a brilliant military leader, but he's not super religious one way or the other. Okay, he kind of is willing to swap sides of religion based on wherever he can manage to make the biggest name for himself. And Wallenstein, fighting for the Catholics, crushes the Danes in 1626, and he forces the King of Denmark, Christian IV, to sign this treaty called the Treaty of Lubeck in 1629. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Emperor, Catholic Ferd II, began taking new measures against Protestants in Bohemia to punish them. But he found it really difficult to enforce Catholic demands in German Protestant cities that belonged to the Hanseatic League, or the Hanseatic League. Basically the Hanseatic League was this, trade league of sorts, okay, that the northern German cities participated in, and many of the northern German cities were Protestant. And being that Ferd is from, southern Germany, which is more Catholic, he found it really hard to enforce his Catholic demands on northern German Protestant cities. So in 1629, there's an edict that gets passed called the Edict of Restitution, which allowed Lutherans, but not Calvinists, to practice religion in certain cities. But the 30 Years' War was still being waged at this time. We now enter into a new phase. So the Danes get crushed. The Catholics come out really strong. They are led by von Tilly at first. Tilly defeats Frederick's forces. They then switch to the leadership of Albrecht von Wallenstein, who defeats the Protestant Danish forces. And we now enter into the Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War. England, the Dutch Republic, and another German state called Brandenburg asked the Lutheran king of Sweden, whose name was Gustavus Adolphus, to intervene. And Sweden comes in and subdues Catholic Poland with a 70,000-man army, and then again a combined Habsburg-Polish force in 1629. And shortly thereafter, Ferdinand II and his Catholic electors demanded Wallenstein's dismissal. And they basically say, Wallenstein, you're too much of a loose cannon, you're not devoted enough to the Catholic cause. And they demand his dismissal because he's kind of this soldier of fortune sort of a guy. And they end up selecting the first guy, von Tilly, to stop the Swedes. Okay, but Gustavus Adolphus's Protestant forces go against Tilly in the battlefield, and they defeat the Catholic army and kill von Tilly in Bavaria in 1632. So Ferd had these two great military leaders, von Wallenstein and Tilly, okay? And basically, Wallenstein is still around, but he gets fired, and they chose Tilly to lead this force. But Tilly gets defeated and killed in this battle in 1632. And so now the question is, are they going to go back to Wallenstein? So they do. In April of 1632, Ferdinand II comes back to Wallenstein to save the Catholic cause. And Wallenstein reconquers Silesia and Bohemia. And, Gustavus Adolphus at this time was still making his way south, leading the largest army ever to that point of 175,000 men in the winter of 1632. This is one of the largest armies that Europe had ever seen before. Gustavus Adolphus and Wallenstein, these two leaders now, War of the World sort of a thing, these two brilliant military commanders meet in the Battle of Lutzen in Saxony, which ended up in a draw. But Gustavus Adolphus was killed in the battle. And so overall, we would generally term this a Catholic victory because Wallenstein comes out victorious. Wallenstein, though, gets murdered in 1634, and guess who it came from but the very guy who hired him, Ferdinand II, after realizing that after he fired Wallenstein and chose Tilly for that first battle against the Swedes, Wallenstein had actually reached out to Gustavus Adolphus, the man who he just killed in battle, 3 years earlier. And it got back to Ferdinand II that Wallenstein nearly switched sides and started fighting for the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. And when that happens, Ferdinand II orders Wallenstein to be murdered, and he is killed. The Protestants by this point are being pushed back and forced to make peace one by one. And then the war, after 1634, 1635, about halfway through the conflict, the war changes. And the war becomes less religious, less about Protestantism versus Catholicism, and more dynastical, mostly fighting between the French and the Habsburgs, all right? Because remember, the French were really intimidated by the growing Habsburg presence. So gradually, the French, Swedish, and Protestant German state militaries, armies, band together and defeat the Habsburgs. And they left Spain and Austria. And wait, what does this say? Oh, and left Spain and Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor, now Ferdinand III, who is the new Holy Roman Emperor because Ferd II died, with no choice but to make peace. It basically forces Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Emperor under Ferdinand III to make peace with the Protestant forces. And the result of this peace became known as the Treaty of Westphalia. And the Treaty of Westphalia is a major turning point in European history. It gets signed in 1648. It redrew the map of Europe, and it remained relatively the same for the next 150 years. The treaty itself, the Treaty of Westphalia, was incredibly complicated, and you can see here kind of how Europe looks after the war. The boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire change from before the war. And I'm now going to transfer over to that other PowerPoint here and talk more about the Treaty of Westphalia. So the Treaty of Westphalia, basically it says the unique principles of the 1648 treaty, which finally ended 140 years of religious warfare. Remember, the Treaty of Westphalia is a major thing that you need to remember as a hallmark turning point in history, because it is the last the Treaty of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War is the last religious war in Europe. So, the Treaty of Westphalia is significant, and you're going to want to remember it as kind of the beginning of the age of absolutism. And so the unique principles of the 1648 treaty, which finally ended 140 years of religious warfare in Europe, enshrined the benefit or, quote, advantage of the other, the common good, in the statecraft of sovereign nations. And two men distinguished themselves at this time. France's Cardinal Jules Mazarin, you're going to want to remember some of these names here, Cardinal Jules Mazarin, and Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And these two men were the most responsible for this opening of the principles of nation building. So what we are seeing after the Treaty of Westphalia is a European landscape less concerned with religious pluralism, less concerned about the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, and more concerned with the apparatus of state building, nation building. And we're going to start to see Europe go through a transitionary period here throughout the next several hundred years, or 150 years, until the French Revolution in 1789, Okay, Europe is going to undergo this transition where they're moving away from the idea of nations being defined solely by, their religious identity, and more being interested in creating a national centralized state government with an all-powerful king at the top of society. Remember that prior to this point, many European nations were very decentralized, and kings were constantly vying to hold on to their power and being challenged by all sorts of different people, whether it be other claimants to the throne, people claiming to try to challenge the throne and claim the throne for themselves. That could have been relatives of theirs. It could have been local city governments challenging the king's authority. It could have been high nobles from distant regions in the land that the king had difficulty subduing and controlling. Kings in a pre-age of absolutism time tended to be very, very concerned at all times, about holding on to their power, because their power was constantly being challenged by various groups, the church, distant nobles, other relatives, city governments, etc., etc. The king's power was constantly being challenged. As we move into the age of absolutism, however, the age of absolutism, thanks to the development of new political, designs, new political, what's the word that I'm looking for, apparatuses, they were able to centralize the king's authority and make it so that the state was, the state government was centered under the king's power, under the king's authority. So, this age of absolutism is derived from the traditional assumption of power, which is heirs to the throne, and the belief in this thing called the divine right of kings. Now, we've talked a little bit about divine right before when we talked about James I and Charles I of England. And James and Charles I of England were the first and second Stuart kings after the death of Elizabeth, the last of the Tudor dynasty in England. And when under the Stuart dynasty, under their idea of divine right, they had basically said, hey, look at us, we became king. How did it happen? Well, it must have happened because God chose us to be king. And if God chose us to be king, that means that whatever decisions we make as king are the correct, proper decisions, and they are an exercise of God's will. But remember that in England, absolutism fails. Even though Charles I in particular really tries to implement absolutism in England, it fails in England, and England ends up going through that civil war, and they end up establishing themselves as a constitutional monarchy. But that's going to be the only place in Europe that develops a constitutional monarchy at this time. And remember, all a constitutional monarchy is a monarchy where the king's power has been limited by a legal document, a constitution. And so the English Civil War resulted in the stopping of the spread of the idea of absolutism in England. However, for the rest of Europe, there's going to be this trend where most places in Europe gravitate more and more and more towards creating these absolutist states. And the most quintessential absolute monarch that we need to learn about in Western Europe, in particular France, was Louis XIV. Louis XIV. Now, don't get Louis XIV confused with a later king from about 150 years later named Louis XVI. But Louis XIV was this quintessential absolutist monarch, all right? And we need to talk a little bit about characteristics of Western European absolutism. Absolutism is going to look slightly different in Eastern Europe, but it'll be very similar. But characteristics of Western absolutism, is that sovereignty again is this idea of independence, okay, state sovereignty. And when we talk about sovereignty in this time, it's not so much, when we think of the United States as a sovereign nation, it's not because we're run by a king. We're a sovereign nation because we are autonomous, we have a centralized state government, and the United States is considered its own nation. But sovereignty gets embodied at this time in the person of the ruler. So your loyalty doesn't lie with the state. Sovereignty means at this time that your loyalty rests with the king. Okay? Absolute monarchs were not subordinate to national assemblies. When I say a national assembly, I'm talking about like a legislative body, like parliament. Okay? In England, they don't have absolute monarchies because their monarch is subordinated to the National Assembly, Parliament in England, okay? So absolutism is a little tricky sometimes to wrap your heads around. All it means, though, basically, is that the king's power is absolute and that they believe in this thing called divine right, which means that they believe that God gave the king the power to rule and that thus no one should check the king's power. And then also another characteristic of Western European absolutism is that the nobility in Western Europe was effectively brought under control at this time. And so as we look at this next slide here, a couple of more characteristics. Bureaucracies were often composed of career officials that were accountable to the king. What is a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy is essentially, think of it as a network or an intricate web of people, employees, who work for, in this case, the king, but a bureaucracy can be demonstrated in a lot of different avenues in life, all right? Bureaucracy is kind of this political network, okay, of people who... you have to go through the proper channels in order to be able to influence the king. So, for example, let me give you a modern-day example of a bureaucracy. Okay, a modern-day example of a bureaucracy would be like going to the DMV, for example. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got all these people at the DMV who are just kind of your like regular worker bee type people who work there. And, if you have a real issue at the DMV, you have to go through the avenues to talk to the supervisor, the regional manager, or whatever, okay? There's a certain, you don't just, if you have an issue, you don't just go straight to the boss, okay? Or like take Microsoft would be another one. There's all sorts of bureaucracies in private industry as well as public government. But, like, for example, you call up Microsoft. Let's say you're having a problem with Windows, all right? You don't just call up Bill Gates and ask him to come out and fix your computer. There's a bureaucratic network that you have to go through, channels that you have to go through in order to make your way up. So you call up Microsoft. You get connected somewhere in probably Indonesia or something like that. You talk to the person who barely speaks English. They transfer you to their manager. Then you have to talk to their supervisor, rather. Then you talk to the supervisor about the issue. If they can't do it, they transfer you to another department. That's bureaucracy, okay? That's bureaucracy. It's creating a system of people that in order for you to be able to resolve your issue, you have to go through the appropriate channels. If you call up a credit card company, are you calling to create a new account? Are you calling to pay your bill? Are you calling to make a dispute? Are you calling because you're having tech issues with the website or the app? What are you calling for? And then based on that, they'll transfer you to a department. Okay, that's what they're doing with the state at this time. They're creating different departments of the state where different workers have different responsibilities. And that if you want to get to the king, you have to follow this path, okay, of people. You have to go through the appropriate channels. And it's basically, it creates a headache for people. okay, particularly nobles who want to have an influence on the king. The kings in Western Europe start surrounding themselves with these servants, okay, these ministers who are not nobles but are given power to conduct business on the king's behalf. And by creating these channels or networks of people that surround the king effectively elevates himself, inoculates himself against the wishes of other people. Okay, nobles who would otherwise challenge the king's power are now no longer able to just go directly to the king and speak to him. They have to go through the appropriate channels in order to get the king's attention and get his ear. Now, it stands to reason, of course, that nobles are not going to be happy with absolutism because, of course, as the king's power grows, the noble's power is weakening comparatively, right? As the king's power becomes more and more and more absolute, more and more centralized, the nobles have less and less and less ability to challenge the king's authority. So these bureaucracies were composed of kind of these career officials, people who were usually good at a particular skill set, pretty good at managing others too, These people get elevated to positions that are within the king's inner circle, and they like that because that means that many of them may not even be nobles themselves, but they're happy to be put into a position, so one of these bureaucratic positions that serves the king, because essentially you're kind of leapfrogging other people in terms of the social hierarchy of power. The king likes it because since you're not a noble, all right, you can be just fired at any time. So if you're not doing your job, or if the king finds that you're failing to perform, then he can just fire you, get rid of you, and then you're gone. Which you can't fire nobles because they're entitled to their noble title by birth. So this is another reason that kings start using bureaucracies, is because it allows them to put people into positions that essentially they can just get rid of and fire them immediately. But of course, the people who are being put into these positions, because they know they can be fired, it also means that they have a whole heck of a lot more interest in doing their job well and serving the king loyally. So these are some of the techniques that kings are using at this time to create a buffer between them and people who would otherwise challenge their authority. French and Spanish monarchies gained effective control of their Roman Catholic Church, of the Roman Catholic Church in their territories. European nations with absolute monarchies started to develop standing armies during peacetime, which had not been a very common practice prior to the age of absolutism. So you now have a standing professional military that at all times is ready to either defend or wage war. And then finally, the development of secret police forces weakened their political opponents, the king's political opponents. So they would start using things like spies and other things like that, secret police, to collect information on their opponents, their political challengers. And then finally, you might even say that the age of absolutism in some sense foreshadows the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, like the Nazis and the Soviet Union. But it lacked the financial, technological, and military resources of the 20th century dictators like Stalin and Hitler. And so it foreshadows it, but the age of absolutism is different than totalitarianism. Plus, it's kings, not military dictators. Okay, political thought. How do we get to the age of absolutism? Well, one of the creators of the age of absolutism, or guys who inspired the age of absolutism, is a guy named Jean Bodin. And Jean Bodin was among the first to provide a theoretical basis for absolutist states. Jean Bodin had witnessed the horrors of the French Civil Wars, the wars against the French Huguenots, okay? For example, the War of the Three Henries. And he believed that only absolutism could provide order and force people to obey the government. All right, Jean Baudin, basically saying absolutism is necessary if we don't want political chaos breaking apart across Europe. Another major thinker of this time is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes, unlike Jean Baudin, who is from France, Thomas Hobbes was from England. And Thomas Hobbes witnessed conflict in his time, too, because he lived through the English Civil War. And he saw many of his own friends killed during the English Civil War, which was a crazy time for England. So Thomas Hobbes wrote a piece called Leviathan in 1651, and he basically argues in Leviathan that humans in a state of nature are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish people. Okay? He does not have a very flowery opinion of humankind. Okay? He generally thinks that people are selfish, nasty, brutish, self-interested, and just kind of not very good, not very nice. That humans are, wicked. Okay? And if you know anything about what a leviathan is like this evil sea creature thing. Okay? And he's basically arguing that humans, due to their human nature being so nasty, need to be controlled. Okay? And so when he wrote this book, Thomas Hobbes wrote this book, Leviathan, in 1651, he basically said that political sovereignty is derived from the people who transfer it to the monarchy by implicit contract. Basically what he's coming up with is this idea of something called a social contract, and that's a term that is going to come up again and again and again in our lecture, this unit, because there are various different versions of the social contract, okay? And in Thomas Hobbes's version of the social contract, in his version, he basically says, I believe that the social contract between people and government is that people will willingly give up their freedom, give up their independence in order to be returned with safety, security, defense, law and order, okay, by the king. All right? And he basically said that the idea of absolutism is less about divine right, okay? It's not so much that God gave the power to kings to rule, but more by way of a political social contract between the governed and the government. All right? Now, we have to understand that Hobbes was not very popular in the 17th century, the 1600s. All right? But he wrote this piece, and if you take a look here, this is the frontispiece from the book that he wrote, Leviathan. Okay? And Leviathan was basically talking about how absolutism is necessary in order to retain law and order, and that the way that absolutism works isn't just because the king is given power by God, but instead that the king's power comes from the fact that people under a strong central absolute king willfully give up their authority to the king in order to get in return safety, security, and so on. And if you take a look at the armor that this king on this frontispiece of Leviathan is wearing, you'll notice that his armor is made up of people. Okay? It looks like he's just wearing regular chainmail armor on the piece, but it's actually, if you zoom into it, it's actually a bunch of people. What does this mean? It's the idea that people, willfully give up their own freedom in order to be protected by the king. Okay? Now you have to understand the reason that Thomas Hobbes wasn't very popular during his time is because remember that England, which is where he was from, is not absolutist. Yet here he is making an argument that the king should be absolutist in nature. And so that's why he's not particularly popular in England at that time. Now, I'm going to stop the PowerPoint there for today because I don't know if you realize, but I have already covered an immense amount of information. And I kind of want to let that percolate for a bit, let that brew inside your brains for a little while. And the way that we're going to go about doing this is that for today's assignment, I have for you it's going to be a packet of primary resource documents, but I'm only going to have you look at one or two of them today for your assignment for today's class, which will be a HIPPO assignment. And so, so I'm going to post that to Canvas here shortly, and then you'll be able to just use the regular HIPPO template page, and then answer a handful of questions for, I think, 2 of these documents, if I'm not mistaken. So that brings us to the end of where I wanted to get to today. I'm pretty much overloaded with work. I'm at the point in the semester where I'm kind of freaking out a little bit because I have just, at all times, I'm just like constantly busy. And it's wearing on me, I'm not going to lie. I'm hurting over here a little bit, but I'm going to be trying and getting your tests done as absolutely soon as possible. The problem is that I teach so many classes, it makes it really, really hard for me to find time to sit and grade for hours at a time. And so I'm definitely burning the candle at both ends over here, but I'm doing the best I can. Just be patient, and like I say, every time that you hand something in on time, you are doing me a major, major favor. Every time that I have to stop and deal with another late assignment, another whatever, it just slows me down and it puts me even further behind than before. And so it would really, help me help you in that sense. If you could just be on top of your work and getting things in, it would really, really help me out. Because I can't even tell you how many hours I've spent the last 3 weeks grading late work and other things like that. I'm really struggling, and so and I'm doing my absolute best, but it's like there's only so much I can do in a day. So anyhow, kids, I'll post these readings on Canvas. Be sure that you're using those HIPPO template. The HIPPO template, and then the other analytical device that I've taught you guys about before, which is the Persia, okay? Be thinking about, as you read these documents, what is this about? What lens does it fit into in history? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it religious? And so on and so forth. These are the sorts of skills that we're trying to develop. Right now, they're talking tentatively that we will be returning to school somewhere in the next couple of weeks. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a couple of other things that happen first, I think. I'm not really sure how all of it's going to work, to be honest with you. But anyhow, so that's kind of the story there. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to shoot me a message on Canvas if I need to clear things up. If you need to rewatch today's lecture, feel free to do so. The link won't change. You can do that at any time. And outside of that, I will be, giving you guys a new reading guide and all of those kinds of things as well. But today we're going to do some HIPPO assignment work, and then I'll put the reading guide up just so you can get started on it. But I'm not going to make that due for Friday. I'm going to make that due for Monday. All right. That way it gives you some time to do this other stuff that I want you to do. So. All right, folks, I'll be putting all that up on Canvas in just a short bit here, and really pretty much I'm going to try and use my entire day today grading exams, mostly essays. And so I will see you back here on Friday morning, and have a great rest of the day. All right, folks, bye-bye.